What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Friday, May 30th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. 12-game slate tonight was 13. The Orioles and White Sox have been moved to 4:30 because we're supposed to get bad storms in the area around the time that game was originally scheduled. So apologies for the late start. Was aiming for 12:30 on this one. Had to rerun stuff for the Orioles game moving. And then once I did that, I realized that it was basically all useless because ownership is just not in the ballpark right now in enough spots that the lineups I had just wouldn't be lineups that I'd be playing later probably. So I do have the optimal percentages for everyone. I'll take a look at those as we go through game by game, comparing that to projected ownership right now. But again, if I'd gone through player exposures, it just would have been stuff that I think would have very obviously been changing between now and lock. And so it wouldn't have really mattered. So I reran again for that. And now I should be good to go. So again, 12 gamer tonight, no more Orioles and White Sox. Looks like we do not have any major weather concerns on this slate now. I think the only other game with legitimate weather looks like it's Philadelphia, which is also not on the slate. So we'll get into this one. My Saber Sim screen, I think, is also frozen. Nope, there we go. So yeah, should be good to go now. Going to go through every game using the Run the Sims projections as usual. As a reminder, if you do want to use these, the link is in the description below. Sign up using that link. These are the projections that those of us over at Endgame, Utica, most importantly, have put together and are continuing to work on. We just rolled out a little bit of an update a couple days ago that we've been really happy with, just changing the way that we approached hitter contact quality so far this season. We found kind of some outlier issues and fixed that. So really happy with that. Really happy with how that's looked since testing that out. So you can sign up using the link in the description below. And also, as a reminder, that does include the projections overlay that just overlays our projections onto your DraftKings lineups page. Great for late swapping lineups, hand building lineups, whatever. And if you are someone that plays lower volume, doesn't make sense to outlay a ton of money for projections and Sims tools and all of that stuff if it's going to be impossible for you to recoup. Just actually had someone mention it in a different context to me on Twitter, how expensive it is nowadays to get access to tools. If you are a low stakes DFS player, it basically just doesn't make any sense for you. We do have a $10 package that just gets you the projections overlaid onto the DraftKings screen. So you can't download them, upload them into optimizers, any of that stuff. But if you are building by hand, playing lower stake stuff, playing a few lineups, you can get them overlaid directly onto your screen to help you build. That's just $10 a month. Again, same link in the description below. And then use the promo code UTAMLB that you see at the bottom of your screen. Gets you 10% off. So starting with the A's taking on the Blue Jays, this game went crazy yesterday with the Blue Jays scoring, I think, 12 runs in that one. Today, we have Chris Bassett taking on Jeffrey Springs. Bassett pulling about 13% ownership. He is showing up as optimal about 12% of the time for me. So it looks like the field pretty much has this one correct. $8,600 price tag, 16 fantasy point projection on Bassett. He has been solid so far this season, striking out 23.7% of hitters. That's up about 1.5 points from last year. Stuff plus grade is about the same as last year, but we have seen about a 7-point uptick in his pitching plus grade. Normally what that means is that when you see it in the context of a little bit of an increased strikeout percentage, stuff plus being about the same, but pitching plus being up, generally it's going to mean that one of two things. It's going to mean that he's either commanding the ball better because pitching plus does try and factor that in, whereas stuff plus doesn't, or it can have to do with the biases that stuff plus has towards a couple of different pitch types. If you have a pitcher that is very reliant on a changeup, for example, a lot of times their stuff plus grade isn't going to be all that good because it naturally is biased against changeup splitters. It generally favors fastballs and sliders. In Bassett's case, it's probably a command thing, just seeing, better command from him. He does also throw a splitter a decent amount of the time, so that could be a factor as well. But overall, just looks like a, secondary option here on a slate where you have 24 pitchers going. The A's are an above average offense in terms of production. They, on average, are also very difficult to strike out, so not a great matchup here. Their active roster ranks 27th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They are 6th in WRC+. When you talk about their strikeout rate, it is skewed by a couple of individual hitters, but those hitters are usually towards the top or in the middle of the lineup as well. So it's not like it's really throwing things off. It's not really misleading. Like Jacob Wilson is very difficult to strike out, and Duhar has not struck out at a high rate so far this season. But those guys both hit, Wilson generally hitting 1 or 2, and Duhar usually hitting around 5. So those are both hitters that Bassett's going to have to face more often than guys at the bottom of the order. So it is going to pull down the projected strikeout rate. So Bassett looks okay here. And then Jeffrey Springs not getting much ownership. $6,500 price tag is cheap. He does have some semblance of talent, does have a really good changeup that can generally keep right-handed hitters off balance. So far this year, striking righties out 19% of the time with a 167 expected ISO. If you go back to last season, 21.8% K percentage against righties, 157 expected ISO, in large part because of that changeup that has a 24% swinging strike percentage. He's thrown it about 30% of the time to right-handed hitters, but this is a Blue Jays lineup that is very difficult to strike out. So if you are getting the Springs, I think it's just because of the value. But on a slate that has 24 offenses, you're just going to have cheap bats that you can get to as well. So Springs only showing up as optimal about 4% of the time, sub 2% projected ownership. Hero Non-Zero said, love this, actually early enough that people can use the info. Yeah, I did this the other day, started it at 12 or 12:30. Feedback was really good. So I am looking to do it, around 12:30 more often. Sometimes it does kind of conflict with other things I have going on, but in general, I do think it'll actually be more consistent at this time than when I was trying to do it at like 5, because sometimes things just end up coming up having to do with making lineups and not being able to get the show done. Whereas if I aim for like this 12:30, 1 o'clock range, I think I will be able to get this show out a lot more often. So gonna keep doing that since people seem to like it anyway. Looking at the bats here, don't love either offensive spot when you look at the matchups. There is some ownership coming into this game. Starting on the A side, not much ownership coming in here. Sub 5% projected ownership to everybody. Lawrence Butler getting the most. He is only 4,200, so a good price tag for somebody that has the power and speed that Butler does. But again, it's a 12-game slate. He's an outfielder. You're going to have a million good outfield plays to get to. So far this season, lefties have a 166 expected ISO against Bassett. Not great, not bad. So I think that kind of just sums up the A's in general. Like, they're a talented offense. There is upside here. Any of Butler, Rooker, Langeliers, Soderstrom, like, these guys are fine to get to, but it's pretty much impossible to call them anything close to a priority on a slate with this many offenses. On the Blue Jays side is where I think it's interesting, because you do have ownership coming in here. They're coming off the huge game yesterday. They are affordable, and I think that's the biggest selling point for Toronto, is that this is an offense that really, for the most part, has underperformed so far this season relative to the track record that most of their hitters have. Their active roster against left-handed pitching since the start of last season ranked 17th in WRC plus at 100, only an 18.9% strikeout percentage. What stands out, though, is, you have Anthony Santander at only $3,500. You have Vlad at 4,800, which, obviously isn't super cheap, but he's historically worth it. Springer at 4,300, Ernie Clement only 2,400, Kirk at catcher at 3,200, Bo Bichette only 4,100. Like, you have a team where if you just look at the talent in the lineup, you can build these lineups where, like, you stack Toronto, and then because they're so cheap, you are able to get to good pitching, you're able to get to good one-offs around them. And so when you kind of just step back and view it from like a macro standpoint, you have a lot of talent point per dollar in this lineup. So you are getting some ownership, 13% projected to Vlad, about 10% apiece to all of Bichette, Kirk, Clement, Santander. In terms of optimal percentage, I do think that they're a little bit overowned, basically 5 to 7% chances of being optimal for those guys, while they're getting about 10% ownership. So they still look fine. But I will, kind of mention, I mentioned it talking about Springs, that he does have a good changeup that can keep right-handed hitters off balance. That's a pitch that generally is going to play better against opposite-handed hitters. So not a total gas can or anything like that. 318 expected WOBA to righties so far this year, 313 if you go back to the start of last year. And then the A's do have a solid bullpen behind him as well. So if this is a game that is just kind of like 3-2 into the middle innings, you are probably in trouble. So I think, it's kind of two conflicting things here. When you build DFS lineups in MLB, you don't, like I mentioned that you're probably in trouble if things haven't gone well the first 5 or 6 innings. Your lineup it doesn't matter what team you're talking about. If things haven't gone well the first 5 or 6 innings, you're probably in trouble. But on the the counterpoint to that is if things do go well, and certainly this is a team that has the offense, the capability for things to go well, you have a really good point per dollar ceiling. So I do understand why there's some ownership here. The upside point per dollar looks really good. I do think they're going a little bit over owned right now. And I did just want to point out that even though this is a right-handed heavy lineup against a left-handed Springs is actually a left-handed pitcher that is set up to do a pretty decent job of limiting right-handed power, given his pitch mix, given what he relies on, the fact that he does have a good changeup. Angels are taking on Cleveland in Cleveland, about a 4.5 implied run total for the Guardians, around 4 for the Angels. For Cleveland, we have Luis Ortiz. For the Angels, we have Jose Soriano. About a 16.5 fantasy point projection for Luis Ortiz. He looks good here at 6K. Price tag is just really, I think, cheaper than it should be. So far this season, he's actually struck out 25% of hitters. His stuff plus and his pitching plus grades are both below average. So maybe we see that strikeout percentage trend, back towards where, closer to like 20%, where you probably expected it to be coming into the season. But so far through 53 innings pitched, does have a 25% K rate. 97 stuff plus grade is not terrible. It's just not in line with like a 25% K percentage, but he does have the best matchup possible for strikeouts for right-handed pitchers here. The Angels so far this season, they've now fallen behind Colorado, which is just shocking given where Colorado plays their games. But the Angels active roster has the second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. This is also a spot where pay attention to the lineup the Angels run out there. Moncada left yesterday's game early. The Angels added Chris Taylor to their roster the other day. Chris Taylor is a super high strikeout percentage guy and somebody that can play multiple positions. So he is somebody that when you get injuries is likely to just find his way into the lineup. If you get the version of this lineup that has like Joe Adell and Chris Taylor, it's an even better strikeout matchup than normal. But at 6K, Ortiz is just going to look good. About a 17% chance of being optimal, about 20% projected ownership. On the other side, for Soriano coming in at 7,800, pretty tough sell here, I think. Tough strikeout matchup against the Guardians. Soriano, not a great strikeout pitcher. Cleveland actually is up to 12th in strikeout percentage on their active roster, but they do have a couple guys at the top that are tough to strike out, with Steven Kwan probably leading off, with Jose Ramirez batting third. And so those are guys that are going to drive down the actual strikeout projection for Soriano. And then Soriano himself, not a great strikeout pitcher either, only striking out 17% of hitters so far this season. What Soriano does do extremely well is get ground balls. Last I checked, among qualified starters, he was the league leader with like a 63% ground ball percentage, just ahead of Andre Payante. Not sure if he's first still or if he's fallen to like second or third, but either way, an elite ground ball pitcher. But that doesn't lend itself to a ton of fantasy points. Usually he's somebody that on shorter slates, I don't mind playing, just hoping that, he gets a lot of weak contact, a lot of ground balls, makes it through 5 or 6 innings. But on a 12-game slate where he's not even that cheap at 7,800, 4% chance of being optimal, sub 2% projected ownership. Not a ton of interest in the bats here for me either. On the Angels side, you are getting them outside of Los Angeles. We know this Cleveland Park now does play up left-handed power a lot, but you don't have any left-handed power outside of potentially Moncada in the Angels lineup. So I think it's pretty tough to want to get to them too much. If we look at Luis Ortiz so far this season, 274 expected ISO allowed to lefties, only 184 to righties, is still relatively high. I do think it's worth pointing out that his expected ISO to righties this year is 85 points higher than his actual. So he has run really well so far in terms of he's limited power to righties, but it looks to be a lot of smoke and mirrors. You do have some right-handed power in this Angels lineup with, Neto at the top of the order, with Taylor Ward in there, who is still only $4,100. Joe Adell, if he's in the lineup, Soler, Ohapi. There is right-handed power here, but not anything that really looks like a true priority. They probably are going a little bit under-owned in the sense that they're projected for like 2 to 3% ownership across the board, and their optimal rates are like 3 to 5%, but still relatively low priority plays. So I think, they're a team that maybe I get to some in like the $8, 30,000 entry, 50K to first. Probably not a team that I'm really looking at too much in single entry just because they're relatively low probability. The case that I think you would make for them in single entry is that not only are they going to be low owned, but Ortiz is projected for 20% ownership in large field. And it probably, I would think, ends up being even higher in small field because he's such a good point per dollar projection at 6K. That's the kind of guy that you pretty often see driven up in small field. So if you want to go the leverage route, I think it probably makes some sense. I would like it more if this were like a 5 or a 6 game slate. On the other side for Cleveland, I mentioned it with Soriano, and I think it's going to be the issue liking Cleveland bats too much is that Soriano does such a good job of keeping the ball on the ground. 2/3 of the time that the ball's put in play, he's getting ground balls. 119 expected ISO to lefties, 115 to righties. He's not a great fantasy pitcher. He's not a great real life pitcher, but he is great at this one particular thing that limits your home run power. The Angels do have a below average bullpen behind him. So if you can get to him early, you are likely to be able to get some advantageous matchups throughout the game, add on some runs that way. Jose Ramirez is never going to be a bad play. He's getting 8% ownership at 5,700. He leads the team with about a 5.5% chance of being optimal. Clearly nothing wrong with him, but nothing from Cleveland standing out as a real priority for me outside of Luis Ortiz as a pitcher. Nothing from this game, actually, outside of Luis Ortiz looking like a real priority. Next, we have the Rockies taking on the Mets in Philly. So clearly you're going to have at least one priority play in this game because pretty much any pitcher ever facing the Rockies outside of Coors Field is going to be a priority. And I don't think that's any different with David Peterson here. Peterson is coming in at 9K. So you do have, the Rockies salary on him. He is a solid, but not great pitcher overall. 21.9% strikeout percentage this year is up about 2 points from last year. Still well below average stuff plus grade at only 90. Below average pitching plus grade at 94.5. Not a great pitcher, but not a terrible pitcher. And he is facing a minor league team here in Citi Field. So I think he's a really good play. I think he's one of the more likely pitchers to succeed. But at the same time, I do think he's also going a bit overowned. He's projected for 36% ownership. He's showing up as optimal about 17% of the time. I've said it a million times on shows. That does not mean he's a bad play. It means nothing beyond he's more popular than he would be, kind of at equilibrium. But you can still make very good lineups. You can make lineups that project to make you money by using David Peterson. You're not trying to make a lineup where all 10 of your players are under-owned necessarily, unless somehow the field is just, has lost their mind and they're just not playing players that are really likely to succeed. At some point, you do also have to have guys in your lineup that are likely to put up a good score for you. And David Peterson is certainly that against this Rockies team that is unbelievably bad. On the other side, Kyle Freeland coming in at 5K. I've also said a million times that any fully stretched out starting pitcher at 5K is technically going to be underpriced. No ownership coming into Freeland, 5% chance of being optimal. But you also want to keep in mind when you're talking about optimal rates that there is going to be a tendency to overvalue really cheap pitchers or plays and kind of undervalue the top end relative to like reality and how you're actually making your lineups. Because what is happening with somebody like Freeland that's 5K is he's going to show up as optimal whenever like the 4 most expensive hitters on the slate do really well in that sim. It's just going to be like, okay, here's 8 points from Kyle Freeland. Now he's optimal. But when you're making your lineups, you're not actually like building that way. You're not trying to build that way. So a long way of saying, I think we can probably ignore Kyle Freeland, even though he is technically underpriced. Offensively here, the Rockies will give you some negative correlation against the field. They do have some decent bats in their lineup. If you want to take some shots at like Hunter Goodman, Tovar, Doyle, they are getting 3 to 4% chances of being optimal at like 2% ownership. Sure, but still clearly very, very low probability plays. On the other side, the Mets have an implied run total north of 5. They are kind of expensive, but not really. Soto only 5,200, Alonso 5,300, Lindor 5,400 in just raw salary. That is pretty expensive. But when you consider the talent that's there with Alonso, with Soto, 2 of the most productive hitters in baseball this year, even though the narrative around Soto is, that he hates playing for the Mets and he's having a shitty year. He might hate playing for the Mets. The shitty year part isn't true at all. And he has hit into some bad luck. So you are still getting him at a really cheap salary for his talent level. Lefty isn't a huge deal. He hits left-handed pitching well. Freeland is obviously better against lefties than righties. But from a stacking standpoint, those guys are relatively expensive, but then it drops off where you have a $3,200 Mark Vientos. You have, Acuna, Marte at 2,900. So the full stack here, if you just want to mix in some of the non-Soto, Alonso, Lindor guys, should be pretty easy to afford. You are getting some ownership here, like 8 to 11% to Lindor, Vientos, Marte, Soto, Alonso, Alvarez, if he's in the lineup, getting about 6% as well. So this is another team where I think they're going a little bit over-owned, but mostly across the board, like 5 to 10% chances of being optimal on a 12-game slate. That's a pretty, a relatively high chance of success. Good spot for the Mets here. Bad Colorado bullpen behind them. And then the other thing to keep in mind, too, when you're talking about over-owned, under-owned, etc., is on a 12-game slate here, like the raw ownership to these guys is still 8 to 10%. So that means even if they are, relatively popular, a little over-owned, 90% of the field still doesn't have these guys. And if you get a big game from Juan Soto, you're in really good shape. So it's just a different context than when you're talking 5, 6, 7 games and your highest owned guys are 20, 25%. And you are really pushing that limit on, okay, what even is the benefit if these guys that I play do well? When you're talking 10% owned guys, it's still relatively low ownership in a raw sense. San Francisco taking on the Marlins in Miami. San Francisco with about a 5 implied run total in this one. Marlins coming in around 4. There we go. Couldn't find the game. Kyle Harrison going for San Francisco. Cal Quantrill on the mound for Miami. Pretty solid matchup for Harrison. Decent strikeout matchup for Quantrill, but Quantrill is not somebody that really gets strikeouts. San Francisco so far this season ranks 10th in strikeout percentage on their active roster against right-handed pitching. Miami, going back to the start of last season, ranks 19th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching on their active roster, but they also have an impossibly bad 62 WRC plus. Now, keep in mind that is just their active roster. Their lineup is going to be different. The lefties that have the worst numbers against lefties aren't going to be in the lineup, but it's not a good Miami offense, rather. Harrison getting 71% ownership, 5% $7,100 salary, 5% projected ownership, 4% chance of being optimal. Very low probability, low owned, just kind of contrarian play if you need him in 150 lineups. In single entry, probably not really going there. Cal Quantrill not getting any ownership at 5,200. Throw him in that bucket with Kyle Freeland. Just not a pitcher with many redeeming qualities here. And you have plenty of other options. So far this season, Quantrill only striking out 16.5% of hitters. 86.5 stuff plus grade is the worst on the slate, and it is not particularly close. No other pitcher pitching today is even below 90. 89 pitching plus grade. The only pitcher worse than that is pitching today there's a few. Priester, Gonsolin, and Abbott, but Abbott and Gonsolin most likely will increase. Priester may or may not. So just one of the least talented pitchers on the slate in Quantrill. Harrison does have some strikeout ability, but also walks a lot of guys, generally inefficient with his pitches. Moving on to the bats here, starting on the San Francisco side, they do look pretty good, both in terms of optimal percentage and in terms of they are getting some ownership. Matt Chapman leading the way, 12% ownership at 4K. Elliot Ramos, 10%. Mike Yastrzemski, 10%. 7 or 8% coming into Adames, to Fitzgerald, to Lee, to Flores, 6% to Bailey. Pretty popular team, like 5 to 10% ownership throughout. But again, that's not disqualifying on a 12-game slate. And I think it is mostly warranted. 9 to 10% chance of being optimal for Chapman, for Ramos, for Yastrzemski, 7% for Adames and Lee, 6% for Fitzgerald, 7% for Flores. They just look pretty good here going up against one of the weakest pitchers on the slate. And while Miami's not a great park for offense or for hitting home runs, neither is San Francisco. So you're not really losing anything here when you talk about the Giants going into Miami. 160 expected ISO to lefties so far this year with a 21% strikeout percentage for Quantrill. Righties have been the really big issue for him. 11% strikeout percentage, 231 expected ISO for Cal Quantrill. Again, Matt Chapman, Elliot Ramos, Willy Adames, Flores, like these guys have a lot of power upside here, especially when you look, for one, if you go back to last year, the splits aren't as drastic. 18% K percentage to lefties, 15% to righties, 157 expected ISO to lefties, 180 to righties. But they do make sense when you look at what he throws as well. He's thrown his splitter 32% of the time to left-handed hitters. That is a pitch that generally not for everybody, but generally plays better against opposite-handed hitters. He's not throwing it this year very often to righties. He's only thrown it 14% of the time. He's throwing his fastball more, his curveball more, his sinker more, his slider more. None of those pitches are good, though. Like, it's great if you're a right-handed pitcher to throw your slider more often to righties if your slider isn't absolute dog shit, but Cal Quantrill's is. It's allowed a 433 expected WOBA this year, sub 10% swinging strike percentage. His curveball, he's allowed a 306 expected WOBA, 16% swinging strike percentage. That's the only pitch he throws to right-handed hitters that has a swinging strike percentage above 10%. The pitch he's thrown the most is his fastball. It has a 510 expected WOBA, a 523 expected ISO. He just doesn't have anything that plays particularly well against right-handed hitters that he throws. So certainly like this spot for the Giants. And that's not to say you can't go to Yastrzemski or Lee, but I really like the spot for like Chapman and Ramos and Adames in particular. On the Miami side against Harrison, middle of the road stack, I think. They are inexpensive. They are facing an unproven pitcher, although somebody that does have some underlying arm talent in Harrison. Nobody getting ownership here, though. Sub 5% across the board. I do think they're going a little bit under-owned. And Miami is a team that did have a couple of guys that were a little bit inflated in our projections. They have been fixed. Agustin Ramirez, one of them. But I do think they are still going under-owned today. Ramirez, 7% chance of being optimal at catcher at 4,300. This is somebody that projects to be basically a league average hitter in terms of production, but an above average hitter from a power standpoint at a position where it's tough to find power. You have $4,200 Otto Lopez with some stolen base upside and multi-position eligibility. Although, keep in mind with the stolen base upside, who is catching for the Giants does make a big impact there. If it is Sam Huff, you can potentially run on Sam Huff. If it is Patrick Bailey, you're probably not running. So keep that in mind. Eric Wagaman, Connor Norby, both around 5% in terms of optimal percentage. 2 to 3% ownership. So relatively low probability stack, not the best offense clearly, but they are really cheap. They are going to give you the ability to get other good high upside plays into your lineup. And there are pieces of this lineup that are not bad. Like Kyle Stowers will be lefty-lefty, so that doesn't look great in the outfield, but we know he has power. Ramirez has power. Wagaman, Norby, like they can do some damage at the plate. So it's not a good offense overall, but there are at least a few pieces that you can target here for cheap. Boston taking on the Braves in Atlanta. 5 to 5.5 implied run total for the Braves, around 4.5 for the Red Sox. On the mound for the Red Sox, we have Lucas Giolito. For the Braves, we have Grant Holmes. About a 12 to 13 fantasy point projection for Giolito at $6,300. Holmes at $8,200, projected for about 16.5 DraftKings points here. It is a solid strikeout matchup for him. It is a scary matchup overall, but the Red Sox do rank 6th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching so far this season. They do also rank 15th in WRC+, so it's not like it's a cakewalk matchup or anything like that. But Holmes is reasonably priced at $8,200. And despite this being a 12-game slate, like there's a lot of total pitching options. There's not really a lot of elite pitching. The highest strikeout percentage on this entire slate is Nick Pivetta at 28%. So this isn't a slate where you have multiple guys, up north of 30% or anything like that. Holmes coming in with a 22% strikeout percentage is pretty solid. Now, I will say, very similar to Luis Ortiz, the stuff metrics do not favor Holmes. 90 stuff plus grade is well below average. 94.5 pitching plus grade is not good either. And again, this isn't an easy matchup. So I don't think Holmes gives you a whole lot of confidence. He doesn't make you feel great, but he is showing up with about a 16% chance of being optimal at about 11% projected ownership. Giolito getting about 2% ownership at 6,300, 7% chance of being optimal. There is talent here somewhere, at some point, at least for Giolito. But so far this season, only striking out 20% of hitters. 95 pitching plus grade is below average. 89.7 stuff plus grade is even more below average. Matchup against the Braves is not ideal, especially now that you have Ronald Acuna back as well. So again, just I think, a cheap pitcher that his optimal percentage probably is a little bit misleading when you consider how it's derived. So not somebody that I have a ton of interest in there. Offensively, starting on the Red Sox side, going up against Holmes, 5 to 8% ownership to most of the relevant hitters here. Devers, Abreu, Duran, Campbell, Narvaez, and Meyer. Trevor Story getting 4%. He has been absolutely awful so far this season. I do think the Red Sox are an interesting tournament stack because, one, they are a high upside offense. They do have pretty good hitters. They are reasonably priced as well. Duran is 5K on DraftKings. Devers is 5,100. Other than that, the most expensive hitter in their projected lineup is Wilyer Abreu at 4,300. So you can build a very affordable, high upside stack here, and then fit good pieces around it. You're getting some negative correlation against a 10 to 15% owned Holmes, and like I was saying, Holmes' stuff isn't particularly good. He's certainly not a great pitcher, although we have seen his share of good strikeout games so far this year. Righties have a 202 expected ISO against him with a 353 expected WOBA. Lefties have a 171 expected ISO, 316 expected WOBA. Rafael Devers, despite his slow start to the season, has been fantastic. 297 expected ISO, 437 expected WOBA in 176 plate appearances against righties so far this year. 356 expected WOBA for Duran. He gives you stolen base upside as well. Campbell has a 164 expected ISO, which is solid. Wilyer Abreu, again, another lefty here, but 315 expected ISO, 406 expected WOBA at 4,300. Probably the best, or arguably, I guess, the best point per dollar upside. I would say it with more confidence if Devers weren't only 5,100 or Duran weren't only 5K. But I think that whole trio just really has a lot of upside for how relatively inexpensive they are. So there is power upside here. There is some negative correlation. The Braves side is projected for more ownership. Similar chances of being optimal, a little bit higher. Ronald Acuna getting 13% ownership, 7% chance of being optimal. He is expensive. So again, what I was saying with the optimal percentage relative to salary thing does come into play here. But Acuna, certainly one of the higher ceilings on the slate. The matchup against 2025 Giolito, at least what we've seen so far, appears to be a pretty good one. Limited sample, of course, but he has held righties to a 127 expected ISO. Lefties have a 310 expected ISO. You go back to 2023 to get a reasonable sample size, 196 expected ISO to righties over that sample, 223 to lefties. Most likely, Giolito is just not very good at limiting power anymore, so that does look good for Acuna. I do want to pull it up. I haven't actually looked. Giolito, if I remember correctly, used to be unbelievably bad at preventing stolen bases. I don't remember if he fixed that or not, so double checking that now. 2023, in 184 innings pitched, he allowed 13 stolen bases, so that graded out as average. So in recent seasons, he's been average at preventing stolen bases. There was a year back in 2018 where he allowed 26 stolen bases, but still a spot where I would expect the Braves to try and run a bit here. So you get some added upside there. Austin Riley, only 4,600, just a really cheap price tag on him. He's getting 8% ownership, 6% chance of being optimal. Albies, Ozuna, Olsen, Baldwin, especially if he's hitting up in the order. These guys all look pretty solid. I think the Braves look like a pretty good stack here against Giolito, especially with, again, Giolito just not looking like the same pitcher that he was prior to injuries. St. Louis taking on the Rangers in Texas. Nice park upgrade for St. Louis power. Not necessarily from Baltimore, where they played their most recent series, but compared to Busch Stadium. Jack Leiter going for Texas. Matthew Liberatore going for the Cards. These are both pitchers that I actually think have shown positive signs this season. Liberatore so far striking out 21.5% of hitters. His stuff plus grade is up to about 3 points from last year to 99.5. But where you've seen a big jump for him is going from an 88.7 pitching plus grade last year to 103.9 so far this year, a 15-point jump. Again, that's a metric that does factor in command, that tries to quantify how well you're actually locating your pitches, in addition to simply how well your pitches, how good your pitches are. So that's a big jump for him, likely just a better pitcher. This is somebody that did have a pretty decent pedigree, was pretty highly thought of as a pitching prospect, but only projected for 3% ownership here. He's just expensive at 8,700. You do have Corey Seager back for the Rangers. Obviously, he is a lefty, but he's a very good hitting lefty. Overall this season, Liberatore has struck out 22.9% of left-handed hitters. He has, 21.5% of left-handed hitters. He struck out 20.8% of righties. 124 expected ISO to lefties, 164 to righties. I think it's pretty likely that Liberatore has a solid start here, but I think it's mostly just the price tag and the fact that he's still not a great strikeout pitcher. On the other side, $6,900 price tag on Jack Leiter. Not a great strikeout matchup here against the Cards. And as I mentioned, it is a park upgrade for them too in terms of power, but they rank 26th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They rank 11th in WRC+. So it's not an ideal matchup for Leiter, and as a result, he doesn't project that well. Doesn't look like any sort of a priority. 5% chance of being optimal, around 2% projected ownership. And so far this season, he has only struck out 17.5% of hitters. His stuff grades out much better than that. 110.2 stuff plus grade for Jack Leiter is very good. 97.5 average fastball, mile per hour average fastball velocity for Jack Leiter is very good. Pitching plus grade is about average at 99.5. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point between now and the end of the season, you start seeing Jack Leiter rack up some more strikeouts. Highly regarded pitching prospect. Stuff is very good. Strikeouts just haven't been there. That being said, probably not going to start happening against the team that strikes out at like the 5th or 6th lowest rate against right-handed pitching this year. Offensively here, while I don't love either matchup because I do think both pitchers are solid, I do like the park for power. And starting on the Cardinals side here against Leiter, you're getting 5% or less projected ownership coming into this entire team. And I think that is a little bit too low, just given the park and the fact that there is power in this lineup. Brendan Donovan, about a 9% chance of being optimal. Second base and outfield eligibility for him against right-handed pitching so far this season. Donovan has a 209 expected ISO, a 429 expected WOBA. The expected ISO is about 75 points higher than his actual 136 ISO. So that's something to keep in mind as well. He's been pretty unlucky in terms of turning actual power into expected. And that is something that you would expect to happen when you play your home games in St. Louis. It's the kind of thing that can correct itself pretty quickly when you start playing games in Baltimore, where if I remember correctly, he homered in the series finale. Then you go play in Texas. You can see that those numbers start to converge pretty quickly. So I do like Brendan Donovan here. Herrera is expensive, 5,300 at catcher, getting 4% ownership, 7% chance of being optimal. He has power at catcher if you can find a way to afford him. So far this season, Leiter, 245 expected ISO to lefties, 155 to righties. So you have seen traditional splits from him so far. Sample size gets a little bit bigger if you go back to last year. 228 expected ISO to lefties, 195 to righties. So I do think that there is power upside here. And Arenado is not getting any love at 4,300. Nootbaar, 6% chance of being optimal at 4% ownership, 5% chance of being optimal for Wynn and Contreras at around 3% ownership apiece. I think the Cards are just going a little bit overlooked here in a solid park upgrade for home runs against a pitcher in Leiter that, again, I think has good stuff, but so far hasn't turned that into a lot of strikeouts and hasn't really shown the ability to limit quality contact either. On the other side, I think Texas going a little bit underowned as well, even though I don't love the matchup against Liberatore. It just goes back to what does it look like in this park when an offense does well? And that's something that I think tends to get overlooked when you're talking about teams to stack, teams to target, matchups, and all of that. There's obviously this tendency, and I'm not saying it's wrong, like I know I do it too, but there's this tendency to like really hone in on the starting pitcher, what they struggle with, how likely the team is to succeed. And obviously that's important, but there is also a component where it's just when this team succeeds, what does it look like in terms of DFS production? In some parks, it looks like singles, doubles, just a bunch of RBI hits, and your guys accumulating 3, 5, 7 fantasy points at a time, which is good, but it's not necessarily going to win you tournaments. In a park like Texas, what it looks like when the opposing pitcher has a bad game and your guys are just coming through is doubles, home runs, more home runs. And for this Texas team, potentially some stolen bases too. So when it goes well, what does it look like? Argument for Texas is pretty strong here, especially when you consider how inexpensive they are. Corey Seager, only 5,100. Wyatt Langford, 4,800, which is actually a drop from recent salaries. Other than that, though, sub 4K everywhere other than Adolis Garcia coming in at 4K flat. So kind of like I was talking about with Toronto, which is the same sort of case. It's when things go well, one, it's pretty likely to be home runs. And two, you just have this really good lineup around them because they're so cheap. So I think Langford's going underowned. I think Young is going underowned. Those two in particular, 7.5% chance of being optimal for Langford at 3% owned. Young with a 5.5% chance of being optimal at 4% owned. And then just mixing in, whatever else is in the lineup. Obviously, if you can get to some $5,100 Seager, that's going to be pretty appealing as well. One other thing to keep an eye on, I mentioned this the other day when they were facing a lefty as well. Kyle Higashioka will probably be in the lineup. Pay attention to two things. One, whether or not Jonah Heim is also in the lineup. And then two, what position Higashioka is playing. If Jonah Heim is not in the lineup at all, pinch hit risk for Higashioka goes up because they can pinch hit for him later in the game and then just replace him with Jonah Heim at catcher. If Jonah Heim is in the lineup and Jonah Heim is catching and Higashioka is DHing, pinch hit risk for Higashioka goes up because they can just pinch hit. They can pinch hit for Higashioka once a righty comes in, and they don't have to worry about what position they're playing. If Higashioka is catching and Heim is DHing, pinch hit risk goes down because while they could pinch hit for Higashioka and then move Heim to catcher, they lose their DH at that point. So they're not likely to do it in like the 5th or the 6th inning. Maybe they do it in like the 8th or the 9th if there's a big spot, but it does lower the pinch hit risk a little bit because they can't do it without having to give up their designated hitter, which is obviously not ideal. So that is something to pay attention to if you're stacking the Rangers when this confirmed lineup does come out. Tampa Bay taking on the Astros in Houston, about a 4.5 implied run total for the Astros, about 4 for the Rays. Framber Valdez is on the mound for the Astros. Ryan Pepio going for Tampa Bay. About 15% projected ownership coming into Valdez, 13% chance of being optimal. I'm actually pretty happy to see that our optimal percentage is more or less in line with his ownership because I feel like I've been under on Valdez every single slate this year. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it hasn't. $9,200 price tag. Not a great strikeout pitcher, not somebody that gets as many strikeouts as you would typically expect from that salary, but not a bad strikeout pitcher either. 23% K percentage this year, was 24% last year. Good stuff, though. 107 stuff plus grade, 113.5 pitching plus grade. Also good at keeping the ball on the ground. I've mentioned before that I have an outcome metric that just tries to give me an idea of how good pitchers are at getting the desired results of at-bats. I weight strikeouts a bit heavier, but it's looking for strikeouts, ground outs, and infield pop-ups, the things that are least likely to do you damage. And Valdez is about 0.4, a little over 0.4 standard deviations better than league average in that metric at getting the desired outcomes of at bats. And again, he's penalized a little bit since I do weight strikeouts heavier. But just overall a good pitcher. Solid matchup here against Tampa Bay. Their active roster against left-handed pitching since the start of last season ranks 20th in WRC plus. They rank 11th in strikeout percentage. Valdez so far this season against right-handed hitters, 22.5% K percentage, 153 expected ISO, 26% K percentage against lefties with a 149 expected ISO. So if Tampa Bay were to run out a lineup with more lefties than expected, the strikeout projection on Valdez would increase a little bit. As is, you're expecting a lineup that probably has like 8 right-handed hitters and Brandon Lau or something like that. But Valdez still looks like a pretty solid mid-range option here, all things considered on this slate. For Pepio, 7,400 going up against the Astros, 6% chance of being optimal, no ownership coming into him. If you want to use him as a relatively cheap way to be different in large field tournaments, I think that's fine, but he's not somebody that looks like any sort of real priority. His strikeout percentage so far this year has dropped off quite a bit from last year, down from 26% to 20%. Now, I don't really know what to make of that because his stuff plus grade is down, but it's still above average. It's down from almost 110 to 106.5. His pitching plus grade is actually up to 109.5, and his fastball velo is almost identical to last year. So I don't really know what's driving the drop in strikeouts here. There's nothing that really jumps off the page in terms of, he's not throwing as hard or his stuff looks worse or he's not commanding the ball or any of that. It could be, driven by matchups. It could be driven by rust and, him just kind of slowly rounding into form as the year goes on. But I do think there's a pretty decent chance that you see those strikeout numbers start to elevate at least somewhat going forward. Looking at the matchups that he has had so far this season, Colorado, Pittsburgh, Angels were his first 3. Like those are all easy strikeout matchups. Face the Red Sox, which is an above average strikeout matchup. Yankees, Padres, which is brutal. Yankees again. Phillies, Toronto is brutal. Houston, Toronto again. So like he's had some tough strikeout matchups lately, but even that doesn't completely explain it because he struck out 7 in 6 innings against the Blue Jays 3 starts ago. So I don't really have a good answer for why his strikeout numbers are down. I am encouraged by the stuff metrics, but at the same time, we're talking 63 innings pitched now. Strikeout percentage stabilizes pretty quickly. So there is something going on here why Pepio is not getting a lot of strikeouts. Very long-winded way of saying I think he's fine if like he lands in some lineups if you're playing 150. Probably not somebody that I would really care about getting to if I'm playing single entry or 3 max or anything like that. Offensively, not a ton of interest in the Rays, but I do think that There are a couple bats here going a little under-owned. Yandy Diaz in particular, only getting about 3 or 4% ownership at 3,900. First base and outfield eligible, about a 7 to 8% chance of being optimal. Since the start of last season for Diaz, 216 expected ISO, 398 expected WOBA against left-handed pitching. It's obviously not an ideal matchup against Valdez, but it's still platoon advantage and a very cheap price tag for Diaz. Other than that, not a ton of interest for me in the Rays. If you want to get to some Caminero or Jansen, I think that's fine. Caballero probably in the lineup with MPE. You will have to keep pinch hit risk in mind as well here, though. Now, reminder, if you are using our projections, that is baked in, and you can see it exactly what we have on the screen. And so this is something where, if you look at it and you think we're too low, you can bump the projection a bit or vice versa. It's right there for you to see. It's how often they got pinch hit for in our in-house simulations using our pinch hit logic. So you can see it on the screen, but this will be a lineup that you want to pay attention to as well. Not only knowing the guys that are most likely to get pinch hit for, as you can see Curtis Mead on the screen showing up at 30%. But also it's going to potentially change a little bit depending on who is in the lineup. The assumption now is that you're getting Curtis Mead starting at first base with Jonathan Aranda coming off the bench. So it's very likely that once you get a right-handed reliever, Jonathan Aranda hits for Mead. But also you'll want to pay attention to whether or not Josh Lowe is starting, because if you have, let's say, Christopher Morel and Caballero starting in the outfield and Josh Lowe on the bench, then there's a good chance Josh Lowe is pinch hitting for one of those guys once a righty comes in. Whereas let's say you have Caballero and Lowe start, and for some reason Morel doesn't start, then it does lower the pinch hit risk on somebody like Caballero, for example. So you'll want to pay attention to which of the normal lefties are on the bench. Like Chandler Simpson is somebody that can pinch hit later in the game or pinch run. Josh Lowe, very likely to pinch hit later in the game if he's not starting. Brandon Lau, likely to pinch hit later in the game if he's not starting. So it is likely to be a platoon-heavy lineup that does carry some pinch hit risk. You'll want to keep that in mind. On the Houston side, against Pepio, good park for right-handed power. Again, you have the Crawford boxes in left, short porch in left field. If you can get the ball in the air and pull it as a right-handed hitter in this park, you are likely to have some success. Pepio, against right-handed hitters this year, has allowed a 190 actual ISO and a 196 expected ISO. Very interestingly, he has huge reverse splits in terms of strikeouts as well. 25% K percentage against lefties, 16% against righties. He's thrown his changeup 29% to lefties, 20% to righties, throws his slider 29% to righties. I don't really know what's driving the strikeout split, because he only has a 9% swinging strike percentage on his changeup to lefties compared to 22% to righties. He has a 13% swinging strike percentage on his slider to righties, which is higher than anything other than his fastball to lefties. He is getting a surprising amount of swings and misses on his fastball to lefties. So maybe it's some sort of it's possible that he's tunneling very well. Hitters are having a hard time distinguishing the fastball from the changeup. Maybe they are kind of sitting changeup a little bit and then having trouble reacting to the fastball, and that's why you're getting swings and misses there. That's a potential explanation. But so far, we do have a much higher strikeout percentage against lefties than righties for Pepio, and he is giving up power to righties. So, again, you look at a pretty inexpensive $4,300 Altuve, $4,300 Pena. Christian Walker is day-to-day, but if he's in the lineup, he's $3,800. Diaz is not having a good year, but we do know that there is power in that bat. He's $3,500. Jake Myers, $3,700. So, Paredes is $4,700, which is really expensive for his underlying talent level. But I've said it before, this park is built for Isaac Paredes. I thought he was a great addition by the Astros. If you just kind of looked at how your stadium was built, you pull up spray charts on Baseball Savant. Probably the first guy you would grab if you're the Astros is Isaac Paredes. So great fit for the ballpark, but don't love the salary. But I do think the Astros are in that same bucket with the Cards, the Blue Jays. The Blue Jays do have a little bit higher implied run total, but teams like that where if you kind of just take a step back and say, where can I potentially get the most home runs per dollar? The Astros look pretty good. Michael Henry said Altuve's current form is a green light. Yeah, Altuve very quickly seems form in baseball isn't something you're going to care about too much, because it's very, very difficult to figure out when it's starting, when it's stopping. Jose Altuve's form was horrible until suddenly he hit 2 home runs and you had to have him to win a slate, and then he did it again a week later. So it's really hard. It's same with BVP and different stuff like that. It's hard. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's very hard to know when it exists and when it doesn't. But with the one thing that you do want to keep in mind when you talk about any sort of current form is the one thing that can drive a hitter to consistently, not be hitting the ball hard. One, you can just be having mechanical issues that eventually you iron out, or you could just have some sort of underlying health issue that we don't know about because, obviously we know when guys go on the injured list and they're dealing with an injury, but teams aren't putting out reports saying like, yeah, over the course of this 162 game season, this hitter is dealing with a sore wrist because he's played, a bunch of baseball games and that happens, and so you don't get that kind of stuff. And then you get players that are dealing with little, banged up things, and then they get over it and suddenly they're different. So it is, at least in that regard, good to see Jose Altuve hitting the ball. Like, it's, at the very least, it's better that Jose Altuve has hit the ball well recently than if you were continuing to just not hit well at all. So point being, home run upside in this park for right-handed power bats on the Astros, and Pepio has given up a decent amount of it. Detroit taking on the Royals in Kansas City. Not a good park for home runs, good park for offensive production overall. So this is kind of like the antithesis, I think is the right way to use that word. I don't know. I've never tried to use it before in my life, but going for it there, of what I was saying with Texas, where you can get runs in Kansas City, but it is pretty likely that those runs are scored by singles, doubles, extra base hits, stuff that, yeah, it's good. My offense is scoring runs, it's getting fantasy points, but it's less likely that you get those like 4 or 5 home run games from anybody. Starting with the pitching here, Seth Lugo getting about 2% ownership at 8,300. Casey Mize getting about 2% ownership at 8,900. Not a ton of interest in either one. Neither one's a great strikeout pitcher. Neither one has a particularly good matchup here. So far this season, Mize striking out 21.8% of hitters. That is up from last year, from 17% last year. So we've seen more strikeouts from him. He is generally good at keeping the ball on the ground as well. He's about half of a standard deviation better than average in my outcome metric. 98.5 stuff plus grade, 101.8 pitching plus grade. Solid enough pitcher, but really, really tough strikeout matchup for him. Tough strikeout park as well. Kansas City against right-handed pitching so far this year is dead last in strikeout percentage. Part of that is because of playing in this park where you do not get strikeouts. On the other side, again, tough strikeout park for Lugo. Not as big a concern for Kansas City pitchers as it is for opposing pitchers, since it is going to naturally be baked into their salary. We know salaries are derived from, some combination of fantasy point production, ERA, stuff like that. So Seth Lugo pitching roughly half of his games in Kansas City, his actual strikeout percentage is pretty heavily weighting in the strikeout effects of pitching in Kansas City. If he pitched all of his games elsewhere, he would probably have higher than an 18.9% strikeout percentage. But that being said, he's not a great strikeout pitcher. He is a decent pitcher overall, but not a great strikeout pitcher. Dangerous matchup here against the Tigers. They do rank 7th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. They also rank 7th in WRC+. I don't have a ton of interest in either of the pitchers. I don't have a ton of interest in the bats here either, partly because of the park not being great for hitting home runs, and partly because both of these pitchers are just pretty solid, and you have a lot of offenses on this slate. That being said, you do have talent in this game. Riley Green, Terry Carpenter, Gleyber Torres, all quality, high upside bats. The other thing that's kind of keeping optimal percentages in check here is that, Riley Green and Terry Carpenter are both outfielders. Just like I was saying with Lawrence Butler at the top of the show, there's nothing wrong with just betting on the upside of Green or Carpenter. But if you just take like the whole list of $4,000 to $5,000 outfielders available on the slate, there's going to be a ton of guys that are like the exact same as Riley Green and Kerry Carpenter. Gleyber Torres, 4,600 at second base. Colt Keith, if he's in the lineup, is only 2,900 first base, second base. We've seen Javi Baez play well this year, but he's outfield only at 4,200. So that's a tough sell, probably at the bottom of the order also. Green, Carpenter, Torres, I think the best hitting plays from Detroit, but nothing that I think is really a priority there. It is worth noting that Seth Lugo has allowed a lot of power to lefties this year. 240 expected ISO to left-handed hitters. Last year, that number was only 128. In 2023, it was 192. So we saw him kind of take that step forward last year. Did a really good job limiting power to lefties. He's somebody that relies heavily on a curveball that does mitigate opposite-handed production. But so far this year, he has given up power to lefties. So again, that would be a point in favor of Green and Carpenter. On the other side for Kansas City, Bobby Witt Jr. getting 8% ownership, 7% chance of being optimal, 5,600. So price tag has come down a bit. He was over 6K earlier in the season, if I remember correctly. But it's Bobby Witt. Like, use him as a one-off, use him in stacks. It doesn't matter. He's one of the highest upside plays anytime he's on a slate, but he's not a true priority in the sense that his matchup isn't ideal, and there's plenty of other options. 192 expected ISO with only a 14.5% strikeout percentage to righties for Mize this year is interesting. 29% strikeout percentage against lefties with only a 130 expected ISO. So pretty drastic reverse splits there. He's thrown his splitter 31% of the time to lefties with a 31% swinging strike percentage. He has thrown it 19% of the time to right-handed hitters, only an 11% swinging strike percentage. So we have seen a true swing and miss pitch for Mize against lefties that he does not have against righties. So do pay attention to the Kansas City lineup. The strikeout projection for Mize should actually be higher the more lefties that are in this lineup. Right now, you probably have like 5 lefties in there, but the top of the order is probably skewed towards righties with India, Witt, Perez, and Garcia. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. Maybe you get a little bit of a projection bump for Mize later on in the day. But either way, it's a team that is tough to strike out. So no real priorities, but I do think Witt, Perez, you could go to either one of those guys, certainly. Washington is facing Arizona in Arizona, about a 5.5 implied run total for the D-backs, about 4 for the Nats. Merrill Kelly pitching for the Diamondbacks. Jake Irvin is pitching for the Nats in a game between two starters that have not been great. Merrill Kelly striking out 22.7% of hitters this year. Stuff plus grade 91.7, pitching plus 98. Jake Irvin had shown some real signs of improvement last year, but he has fully regressed so far this season. Pitching plus grade is down 4.5 points. Pitching plus grade is down 2 points. Stuff plus grade is down 4.5 points. Strikeout percentage is down more than 3 points. Fastball velo is down 2 miles an hour from last season. Irvin has struggled. Not a good matchup for him either against Arizona. 7% ownership is coming into Kelly at $8,500, 5% chance of being optimal. So again, secondary play if you need him, but doesn't stand out as anything special here. Starting with the Nats hitters, I do think they're going a little bit under-owned for their power upside here in Arizona against a pitcher in Kelly that I don't think is special or anything like that. 162 expected ISO to lefties, 211 to righties this year. Does have a strikeout percentage of 25% against lefties as well. So that is a negative for the Nats when most of their good hitters are left-handed. The fact that Kelly has been reverse splits, his changeup has played well against lefties so far. Only a 106 expected ISO to left-handed hitters on that pitch, a 22% swinging strike percentage. He's thrown it nearly 30% of the time. So this is a negative for Washington when you consider that the hitters you would want to get to are CJ Abrams, James Wood, Luis Garcia in particular. Kelly has done a good job of limiting that left-handed power. But that being said, those guys still obviously are very, very good, very high ceilings, all getting less than 5% ownership. So I don't mind getting to them. Keibert Ruiz at catcher at 3,400. Robert Hassel, former top prospect. He was actually one of the prized pieces of the Juan Soto trade, and then he got surpassed by all of CJ Abrams, Mackenzie Gore, and James Wood. But Hassel has finally made his way to the majors. He's shown some upside in a limited sample. So I actually don't hate the Nats in this park, but I do think that it's certainly noteworthy that Kelly has been reverse splits this year, and I think that there's a pretty clear reason for it. On the other side for Arizona, I would expect them to be one of the more popular teams on the slate. 11% projected ownership coming into Corbin Carroll, 5 to 10% to Marte, Gurriel, Naylor, Suarez. So a little bit less than I guess I expected to see overall, but relatively popular here. Marte is day-to-day. If he's out, it does lower the upside a little bit because you're taking a really good hitter out of the lineup. It does probably also move Geraldo Perdomo up into the 2-hole, though. He is 5K, so it's really tough to play him if he's batting ninth, even though he's been solid production-wise this year. But if he does jump up to the 2 spot with no Marte, that does open up a pretty solid shortstop option for you. So far this season, Irvin, like I said, just has really come back to earth. 286 expected ISO to left-handed hitters with a 387 expected WOBA, 17% strikeout percentage. Righties also only striking out 17% of the time, 170 expected ISO there. I really like Carroll. If Marte's in the lineup, I really like him. Josh Naylor comes with a lot of opportunity cost because of the position, but I really like Josh Naylor. Suarez, doesn't have the platoon advantage, but he has been hitting extremely well so far this season. So far, Corbin Carroll, a 352 expected ISO against right-handed pitching, one of the better plays on the slate. Marte, 364 expected ISO. Naylor, 193. Suarez, 323. Perdomo, 152. So, not a ton of power from Perdomo, but he does have like a 350 expected WOBA. But Carroll in particular, I love. And then if you get to some Marte, some Naylor, some Suarez, great. Gurriel's cheap at 3,600, probably hitting in the top half of the order, even though he's not having a great season. Pirates are taking on the Padres in San Diego. We get to another one of our pitching priorities in this one with Nick Pivetta going for the Padres at $9,800, getting 28% ownership, 21% chance of being optimal. That is the highest rate that I've mentioned so far, slightly edging out David Peterson. Mitch Keller on the other side here in the very difficult matchup at 7,700. Park downgrade for Keller as well. Padres rank fifth in WRC plus against right-handed pitching this year. They rank 28th in strikeout percentage. And this is another one of those teams, kind of like the Blue Jays, where they have good hitters that can do a lot of damage. And those guys just do not strike out nearly as much as you would expect for hitters of their quality. Arise is essentially impossible to strike out, but Tatis, not a high K guy. Machado, Merrill, low K guys. Bogarts doesn't strike out a lot. Gavin Sheets does strike out a decent amount, but also seemingly has rediscovered how to hit for power. I think, I don't know for sure, but I think I saw the stat that he has like more home runs this year than he did all of last year, maybe for the White Sox. So something along those lines. He's played his way into essentially an everyday role. So no real interest in Keller here, but I do think Pivetta looks great. The matchup against the Pirates is a good one. Their active roster ranks 16th in strikeout percentage, but they also rank 29th in WRC plus. I mentioned it earlier, but Pivetta has the highest strikeout percentage on the slate at 28.3%. 107.1 pitching plus grade is well above average. Just looks like a very good pitching option, even at 9,800. Offensively, I don't really have a ton of interest in the Pirates. The case that you would make for them is that they are getting a park upgrade for their bats, and they do negatively correlate with Pivetta. But very difficult time getting to really anything here. O'Neal Cruz would obviously be my first choice. Brian Reynolds would be second. We do have a pretty high home run projection here on O'Neal Cruz, which is not unusual. We generally like O'Neal Cruz quite a bit, but this is not a game where I expect to really be or a slate rather, where I expect to really be getting to the Pirates all that much. On the Padres side, my screen might be frozen. There we go. 5% or less projected ownership across the board. And that's pretty much where I'm at in terms of optimal percentages as well. Machado, Tatis, Merrill all showing up as optimal like 4 to 5% of the time at salaries between 5,200 and 5,500. They are perfectly solid plays against Keller. So far this season, lefties have a 174 expected ISO against him. Righties, though, have struck out 25.8% of the time with only a 101 expected ISO and a 264 expected WOBA. So you do have pretty drastic splits in terms of both strikeouts and production allowed by Keller so far this season. So if you were to single things down to left-handed bats, you're looking, I think, primarily at Jackson Merrill. But again, that's a $5,200 outfielder. For context, yeah, he's really good. That's also the same price as Juan Soto. Probably not that good. But, still a high ceiling for Merrill, certainly. Jake Cronenworth, 4,400 at second base would look fine. Gavin Sheets, I mentioned 3,900 in the outfield. But again, the outfield is just so loaded. So you do run into that issue here with the left-handed bats on the Padres. Yankees are taking on the Dodgers in Dodger Stadium. Very, very good park for hitting home runs between two teams that are very, very good at hitting home runs. Max Fried is pitching for the Yankees. Tony Gonsolin going for the Dodgers. Mentioned earlier, Gonsolin's pitching plus grade so far this season being very not good. But 7,500 for him, not getting any ownership, 6% chance of being optimal. I don't really think he's somebody that you need to worry about too much on this slate going up against the Yankees. Obviously a tough matchup there. Yankees have the second highest WRC plus against right-handed pitching this year. The only team better is the Dodgers. The Yankees do strike out. They have a top 10 strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, but I think we can just find better options. Max Fried getting 3% ownership at 10,300. From a talent standpoint, anytime you get to Max Fried at 2% ownership, you're not going to be mad about it. But the matchup here obviously leaves a lot to be desired. Active roster for the Dodgers, since the start of last season, ranks 24th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching. They are first in WRC+. Max Fried is very good. You could absolutely make the argument that he is the most talented pitcher on tonight's slate. 24% strikeout percentage this year, 107.5 stuff plus grade, 111.3 pitching plus grade. But you're not getting any sort of a salary discount to make up for facing the Dodgers. I would be really intrigued by Fried if you got like, I don't know, an $8,500 salary, $8,800 salary, something like that, where then you could look and say like, okay, well, he's underpriced for his talent level. The price is really factoring in that he's facing the Dodgers. Here, you're getting Max Fried against any team, like an average offense at 10,300. So that's the problem. That's why he's not getting any ownership. I think Fried is basically somebody where, like, if you in large field tournaments have a lineup where you are stacking a cheap team, maybe you have Luis Ortiz as your SP2, you have everything you want in this lineup. You have $10,300 left over. Sure, throw in Max Fried, hope he has a good start against the Dodgers. The ceiling's obviously there. But at the same time, I would look at that lineup and say, do I actually have everything I want in this lineup? Or can I turn, this outfielder into Aaron Judge and then use a pitcher other than Max Fried, something like that. Judge just being the first example I thought of. So that's, kind of how I view Max Fried here. Offensively, both of these teams clearly high upside tournament options, regardless of what pitcher they're facing. The two probably best offenses in baseball. Aaron Judge getting 14% ownership, 13% chance of being optimal at $6,500. Goes without saying, if you can get to Aaron Judge, great. We did see the Angels finally start to just not pitch to Aaron Judge. My guess is that's going to be something, and by I mean Yuta mentioned this as well in our chat, but I think that's something we'll be paying attention to more so for left-handed starters, and then also obviously kind of trying to keep in mind like just what managers are doing it. Like next time Judge, if Judge plays, the Angels again, maybe you keep in mind that Ron Washington has no interest in pitching to him. But I think it's likely that like if you have a left-handed starter, you have Bellinger hitting behind Judge, or Grisham hitting behind Judge or something, like you just walk Judge, you pitch to the lefty. I don't think teams are going to be as inclined necessarily to do it with righties. That being said, this is a perfect example of if Dave Roberts just comes out here and says, look, we're not pitching to Aaron Judge, he is Barry Bonds in game one of this series, you should be projecting Judge lower for the rest of the series. But obviously at this point, we're just assuming that they pitch to Aaron Judge like normal and Aaron Judge does ridiculous shit like normal. So Judge looks great. Beyond that, 5 to 6% chances of being optimal for Goldschmidt, for Volpe, for Bellinger, for Wells, for a very cheap Vivas, for Dominguez. Just a high upside offense, 5% or less projected ownership. Again, this is just one of those teams that has a very big gap between their median projection and their ceiling. This is a park that is good for home runs. This is a team that hits a lot of home runs. If Gonsolin just doesn't have it, you are looking at clearly a team that can win any given slate. And that applies to the Dodgers too. Less likely to succeed against Max Fried than the Yankees are against Tony Gonsolin. Fried's just a better pitcher than Gonsolin. But still, what does it look like if the Dodgers do well is a lot of fantasy points. Shohei Ohtani getting 5% ownership. That's the high mark for the Dodgers. 7% chance of being optimal at $100 less than Judge. Clearly, I would look to get the Judge first. I actually think that the gap between ownership and optimal percentage is pretty much where it should be right now, which is kind of surprising to me. Maybe we just see Judge get steamed a little bit or ownership ends up just being a little bit low. This is a spot where normally I would expect to see like 3-1 or 4-1 ownership on Judge and optimal percent, be 2-1 or 2.5-1. But right now it seems pretty much like, Ohtani's going a little underowned, but pretty much, Ohtani around 6%, Judge around 13%. That all looks fine. Beyond that, no ownership coming into this team. And I think it's really, there's nothing from a matchup standpoint that I can point to. I don't have any magic reasons that like Teoscar Hernandez is a good play against Max Fried, other than Teoscar Hernandez is good at hitting, and Will Smith is one of the best power hitting catchers in baseball, etc. Fried against righties this year, 139 expected ISO, 22.5% K percentage, 305 expected WOBA. You're just hoping that Max Fried isn't locating perfectly and the Dodgers do damage if you go to them, but clearly not a high priority or a high probability team, rather, just given the brutal matchup. And then finally, we are on game number 12. The Twins are taking on the Mariners in Seattle. Brian Wu for the Mariners. Zebby Matthews for the Twins. Matthews, $7,200 price tag, getting 9% projected ownership. Wu, $9,500 price tag, getting about 25% ownership. Matthews ownership or optimal percentage rather, is pretty much in line with his ownership. 11% chance of being optimal, 9% projected ownership. Woo, I think, is going a little bit over-owned, but again, still one of the more likely pitchers to succeed. 16% chance of being optimal, 25% projected ownership at 9,500. Solid matchup here with Minnesota. Their active roster against right-handed pitching so far this season ranks actually 24th in strikeout percentage. I thought it was higher than that, but their WRC plus is also 25th. So you have that, and then you have this park, which is great for getting strikeouts. It's great for limiting production. Einsteinium said Woo's been good at home. Yeah, I mean, the baseline for Mariners pitchers, the expectation should always be that these guys are going to have pretty solid, pretty drastic home road splits. Not even because they're not good. Like, they have good pitchers. You just expect them to be worse on the road because they're pitching their home games in the best park, really, that you can pitch in. So Woo does look good here. Like I said, not the best strikeout matchup. If you look at his splits so far this year, though, 23% K percentage to lefties, 25% to righties. He has one of the higher strikeout percentages on the slate at 24%. The only guys on this slate with a higher strikeout percentage so far this year are Pivetta, Gonsolin in only 25 innings pitched, Ortiz, and Fried. So while 24% is kind of like average-ish on this slate, it's above average. So I think that looks good. Stuff plus grade's above average. Pitching plus grade is excellent at 112.5. For context, that is actually the highest, or sorry, second highest behind Valdez on this slate. It is slightly higher than Max Fried, who we know has been really good. It's higher than Pivetta. So that looks really good for Woo. I think he's a good play here. Again, probably going a little bit over-owned in terms of optimal percentage, but you're not trying to build optimal lineups in baseball, and he's only taking up one spot in your lineup. You should have absolutely no difficulty clicking on Brian Woo or any of the other quote-unquote over-owned pitchers for that matter, and then still making a lineup that, on the whole, is a contrarian enough lineup to do well in tournaments. So pitching in this game is going to look pretty good. Offenses, not particularly interesting in Seattle, especially on a 12-gamer. Sub 2% chance of being optimal for every hitter on Minnesota. Sub 2% projected ownership as well. For Seattle, 4% chance of being optimal to Cal Raleigh, just because he's one of the highest upside catchers in baseball. 3 to 4% ownership there. Polanco, 3%. Rodriguez, 2%. And it just goes down from there. So not really interested too much in the bats in this one. I will say that for the same reason that, like, I was talking about with Seth Lugo and Kansas City pitchers, I do generally I'm a little bit more willing generally to go to Seattle bats in Seattle than opposing bats, just because it is going to be naturally baked into their prices a bit. But that being said, they're still not really cheap right now. We did have Seattle on the road for a little bit. That causes their prices to come up. Raleigh's 5,200. This is more so like earlier in the year, Raleigh was 4,500. He's always been a 5K plus hitter if he just played all of his games in neutral parks. But when you throw him into Seattle, it makes it that much harder to hit home runs. But it's not as baked into these prices right now, so that makes them look a little bit less interesting as well. So now I'll recap everything going through position by position, starting with the pitching. Let me get off this game. Starting with the pitching. So we can see here, Pivetta, Peterson, Woo, the three highest projected pitchers. In terms of optimal percentage, Pivetta, Peterson, Ortiz, Holmes, Woo showing up as the most frequent optimal pitchers. That was a horrible way to word that, but whatever. You get the point. Holmes would be the only one that surprises me and that I think maybe comes down a little bit. Like, at the same time, there's not a ton of good pitching in his price range. You kind of get cheaper pitchers like Ortiz or more expensive pitchers. But I wouldn't be surprised if, like, you saw Holmes kind of fall behind Valdez or maybe Bassett. But mostly, makes sense. It's in line with projections here. And you can see that we have Holmes projected slightly higher than Valdez. Wouldn't be surprised if that comes down a little bit. Going over to catcher. At the top, Ivan Herrera, Agustin Ramirez, Keibert Ruiz, Austin Wells, Will Smith. Pretty flat in terms of optimal percentages at catcher. I think it's very likely that the catchers I play the most of are pretty much dictated by what stacks I'm getting to, and then just, what catcher fits with that stack or with that secondary stack. At first base, at the top, in terms of optimal percentage, looking at Paul Goldschmidt, Pete Alonso, Vlad Guerrero. At second base, looking at Luis Garcia, Ketel Marte, if he's in the lineup. Brendan Donovan, I like a lot. And I will, again, mention with Garcia, this is true for all the Nats lefties. Kelly does have a good reason for being reverse split so far this year, but it is still a favorable price tag on Garcia. At third base, Matt Chapman, I really like a lot. Rafael Devers, Nolan Arenado, Austin Riley, Josh Young, like all those guys. At shortstop, CJ Abrams, again, the lefty thing against Kelly, but he does just project well, at least for us right now. I do really like Willy Adames, Bobby Witt Jr. paying up for him, Anthony Volpe, Jeremy Pena. Those guys all look solid. And then in the outfield, it does look like we're looking to pay up. Aaron Judge, Corbin Carroll, James Wood, Yastrzemski, Ramos, Langford, Acuna, Soto, all guys that are showing up at the top in terms of optimal percentage, and for the most part are pretty expensive as well. Optimal overall stack percentages: San Francisco, Washington, New York, Arizona, St. Louis. Again, in my brain, I'm a little bit lower on Washington. Don't know if that'll be the case in projections by lock or not, but certainly like San Francisco, the Yankees, Arizona, the Cardinals. 5-man stacks: Washington, San Francisco, Boston, Kansas City, the Angels, but pretty flat. Like, there's not a lot of offenses on this slate that you look at and you're just like, yeah, that's definitely, like, I'm scared not to have them. Like, if any offense on this slate were getting 20 to 25% ownership, you would just be like, yeah, okay, I'm not playing them. Whereas, there are some slates where you get like the Dodgers with a 7.5 total in cores, and it's like, okay, they're 25% owned, and it scares the shit out of me not to play them. There's none of those on this slate. So I think it's really wide open as far as just playing kind of whatever you want, because ownership doesn't look like it's really going to be a problem. There's no team that I think has higher than like a 5.5 implied run total. So really, really wide open slate for a home run pick, because I know you guys always ask for those. Going to sort by that here. Aaron Judge, obviously cheating. I do love Corbin Carroll. Like, he's not on the same category as Judge and Ohtani, so I don't know if it's cheating or not. I love Corbin Carroll in this spot, but going beyond him, I'll go with Nootbaar. I like the lefties here for the Cards against Leiter in this park. Brendan Donovan is another one, but Nootbaar projecting really well here. I understand the reasons for it. I agree with it. I like it. So I'll go Lars Nootbaar for a not completely obvious home run pick. That's all I have for you. Thanks for checking out the show. Have a good weekend. Good luck on your lineups tonight. See you back here next week.